So, as I was saying, in the earlier session, we managed to talk about, really, we spent most of the time talking about the chapters and not so much about Obsidian. Obsidian seems to me to be working all right and seems to be kind of stable now. How are you all finding it?
Yeah, I'm finding it. I mean, I've been using it for more than 6 months now, although I must admit I've only just discovered Typora, and the integration of Typora with Obsidian for writing is really hit the sweet spot, because I found that just a bit awkward, even though you can, it's not an outliner, Obsidian, it still feels difficult to get the kind of flow in writing that you would with a, say, Microsoft Word or Google Doc. But
okay.
Yeah, Obsidian for me feels like the kind of platform that the first time in my life, and I've tried many, that I really can't think of wanting to go to any other platform, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've certainly been seeing things in it, and and things that people have been doing with the Vault. Although there's less, going on. There have been less, strange new modifications. It seems to have calmed down a bit, but it's my response to that has been that it's kind of interesting, but I don't feel like I need to, kind of chase down every little thing and kind of figure it out. So yeah, I'm kind of comfortable with the way it's working. I just pulled up Typora on. I wasn't aware of it on my.
Well, I think Typora has really come home to me about the radical nature of Markdown, because it's as a platform, as a code, it's something which is so accessible compared even to HTML, and it means that your writing is not kind of caught up so much within a locked platform like Microsoft Word or Google Doc, and getting your synchronization right with backups and so on. You feel as though you've had a level of security there, but it just enables you to focus on the words and the links, the words and links, and just keeping it like that, rather than all of the kind of more stylistic issues and bells and whistles, as they say, that come with a platform that ends up being bloated. Mm-hmm. It strips it back to what's really critical.
Cool. I'll look at it. So the chapters that we're looking at today. One of the things that kind of struck me first about it, and I think it had a lot to do with the conversations we've been having especially last week, about sort of doubts that people have about kind of the veracity and the trustworthiness of Graeber and Wengrow in these claims that they're making. And Justin, I think you said, you had some thoughts along those lines. And I was looking at the beginning of the 5th chapter, they're talking about the Californians not being into farming, right? And they're talking about comparison with the inventors of farming makes little sense from the perspective of indigenous Californians, who could hardly have failed to notice the nearby presence, particularly among their Southwest neighbors, of tropical crops, including maize, that sort of thing. And they conclude that that people elsewhere in the Americas had adopted at least some food crops. The West Coast people they believe had uniformly rejected them, but they weren't pre-agricultural, they were anti-agricultural. And And the thing that, the thing that struck me about that was that it seemed to me that, okay, this is the type of claim that's going to be challenged. So I went to the notes. There's an end note, second one in the chapter, I think, at the end of the first sentence of that paragraph, and it links to a discursive note that talks about Kroiber and his Handbook of the Indians of California, and it compares a couple of passages of that 1925 book, and it says that that they were aware, that most of the people didn't do agriculture, but then later on in the text he corrects himself and says that a number of them did plant and grow tobacco, right? So Graeber and Wengrow conclude that planting couldn't have been, agriculture couldn't have been really a conceptual innovation. And then they quote Bettinger, who they say noted more recently that agriculture never managed to spread, the fact that agriculture never managed to spread to California was not due to isolation. California was always more or less in direct communication with agriculturalists whose products occasionally turn up in archaeological sites. And that he says, then he goes on to say that Californians developed what he called a superior adaptation to the local environment. And then, so they cite Kroiber once and Bettinger, Kroiber twice, actually, two different spots, and Bettinger once. And so then I looked in the bibliography, and apparently Robert L. Bettinger is a distinguished professor in the social science department at UC Davis, who has 144 publications and has been cited nearly 6,000 times. And just based on the bibliography, he's been writing about, native cultures of the American West and the Great Basin since at least 1982. And the book that they cite, which is called Orderly Anarchy, Socio-Political Evolution in Aboriginal California, was published in 2015. So he's been doing it a long time. What they're citing is very recent. And so this kind of strikes me as legit. And so so I'm kind of willing to accept their claim that Californians knew about agriculture but chose not to use it except to grow ceremonial tobacco.
I mean, so like there's more details that would be satisfying to me, or like I'll jump to my current state of mind with my complaints about their style, I guess, of putting together their arguments. Which my complaint last week for the people who weren't here is like they seem to assume that I'm a lot more familiar with the literature that they're referring to than I am, or that I have time to go and dig into it to find these things out and check what they're saying. But now, having read these 3 more chapters, I've kind of come to the point like, we can differ on what I define a claim to be and what people that work in the anthropological or archaeology department claim, like their definition of claim is. Like, okay, like the materials that they work with is very different from the material that an experimental physicist works with. I can accept that. But like the rate and diversity of claims that they are bringing up, like if they were going to just fabricate all this stuff and like kind of put it together like with duct tape and baling wire based on sketchy literature, like they'd be better off just writing a fiction book and saying like, this is our idea. So like, why even pretend that way? And so like, I've kind of like come to accept that like, I can differ about how they're writing about it, but it seems like there's enough different things that they're bringing up that it's useful to pay attention to their arguments and see what they're saying and not continue griping about what's a claim and what's not. So I've kind of like Stockholm syndrome that one, I guess, and have moved on. And then specifically about this, like I like the stuff they're talking about here, like in the opening paragraphs of chapter 5, like it's like it would help me again that like they're hazy about their dates. Like so, like in one sentence they're talking about things 4,000 years ago, and then they're talking about these publications that were written in 1925 and 2015, and I don't know what years those publications cover. So it's like really hard for me to situate in the very deep past that we're talking about, like where these events that they're just casually referencing in the text are. And so like I'm kind of assembling an imagined narrative to like assemble it together for me, but I have no idea if it's correct. But maybe that's like an accurate representation of our understanding of the deep history. Anyway, so maybe that's fine. I don't know. Anyway, that's where I'm at with it now.
I'd like to respond to that, Justin, because I'm very sympathetic to a lot of what you're saying. I'm turning off my video because I got sick yesterday, so I'm negative on the rapid test, and I'm waiting to hear the PCR. So I figure I really wanted to participate since I was unable to attend last week. I thought last week, chapter 4 provided what they've been promising. Remember, they weren't claiming merely that they're going to take down all the big shots in social science. If they did, then I think the book, well, then we have to start asking, are they right? But what I want to do is abstract from the evidence and figure out what is the structure of what they're arguing. And if we can come up with a coherent argument, then we can say, what are the facts that they are saying are true? And do those facts support the argument? And are those facts true? But before I go down that rabbit hole of checking every footnote, it's not at all clear to me what their project is. So the one thing that I see them saying, I mean, it's pretty clear. These guys love taking down big shots. So if they just said, we're going to write a book and show how fucked up social science is, and we're going to show how all the big names got it wrong. Okay, I'd say, yeah, I get it. That's what you're arguing. But in fact, they're claiming something much larger. And I thought chapter 4 laid out what they claimed they were doing, creating a new theoretical approach to society, a social theory. Now, they keep saying that Rousseau made a fundamental error because Rousseau, I think the quote is, man was born free and everywhere he's in chains or something like that. I believe that they are making an analogous claim to Rousseau, but instead of saying human beings are born free, what they're saying is human beings were born to either collectively choose freedom or choose domination and hierarchy. Play, right? It wasn't serious domination or hierarchy because you had these 3 freedoms. This is, as I understand it, and I'm not claiming I'm right because I find them very confusing. So my goal is to come up with a coherent theoretical structure to this book. And what I believe they're saying is we thought falsely that we could not self-determine society. It was false consciousness. You know, they talk all the time about economic base and social structures. As far as I can see, they never defined those terms. That's pretty bizarre, in my opinion, for a social theory, that you don't define your fundamental concepts. But what do they define? Well, they defined slavery, but the big thing they defined were the 3 freedoms. What were they? The freedom to leave, the freedom to disobey, and the freedom to play with social structure. Now, as far as I can see, they don't distinguish the fact that the agent for those 3 freedoms is different. The freedom to change social structure needs to occur at the social level. Whereas the freedom to escape and the freedom to disobey, that can be at a sub-society level. It could be
It'll be
individuals, or
personal,
it could be small
right.
groups of individuals. So they lay out their framework, in my opinion, in chapter 4. And I think it's page 121. They have a, what do you call it? A section heading, you know, those capitalized, it's in my Kindle, it's page 121. You know, when I was in another Rome book club, even people with Kindle editions had different paginations. So I'm not guaranteeing your Kindle will have the same as mine. But they have a chapter, they have a section heading that says, and then the text under that heading supports. How did schismogenesis arise? What caused schismogenesis? They said population increase caused schismogenesis. So
Yes.
we went from a situation where initially we were free, just the way Rousseau said. Now, that doesn't mean we didn't have hierarchy or domination, but it was play hierarchy. And we were fully conscious that we were free to tinker with relations of domination and hierarchy.
Mhm.
So they lay it out. So now I'm thinking, thank God they have explained why we're stuck, because that is the thesis of the book. We are going to explain why we think we are stuck. Now, I found chapter 5 kind of mind-blowing, because forget about all the data. I know a historian, it sounds like you know, the Antichrist or something. But what do they say in chapter 5? They say, you know what? Whether it's determined, that is to say, all of their opponents are determinists, right?
Mhm.
Their opponents are the technological determinists, the ecological determinists,
Mhm.
economic, they don't define any of this stuff, but
Right.
that's who they oppose, determinists.
Mhm.
And what do they say they are? Therefore, deliberate, intentional social choice. So we created societies and we intended the outcomes we got.
Hey, stop it.
What do they say in chapter 5? They say, you know what? Whether you, and I can pull up the page, I don't have it right
Sorry about that.
here. Okay. In
My
chapter
cat.
5, they say, it's a matter of taste where you set the dial on the spectrum from freedom to determination. And I'm like, so who needs facts?
Well, they do on 180. They do say.
I'm talking a lot. Now, let me say one more thing.
Okay.
So here's the solution that I've come up with. They don't make it explicit, but I'm just trying to come up with a serious theory for them. And here's what I think, and they don't say it explicitly, but here's what I think they're trying to say. And I could be totally wrong, and I want everyone to criticize me with, you know, all your knives sharpened, because that'll help me win better. I think what they're saying is, like Rousseau, we were born free, and any kind of domination was play domination. But now everywhere, when we look at human societies, we are in chains, but they're not real chains. They're ideological, they're false consciousness. So what is the role of social theory? The role of social theory is to burst asunder those ideological fetters. That's it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's well put. I don't really see anything to disagree with. I would say that, though, that on 180, the thing that you were sort of paraphrasing from, where they're talking about schismogenesis and they're saying each society performs a mirror image of the other. In doing so, it becomes an indispensable alter ego, the necessary and ever present example of what one should never wish to be. I think that is, and we saw that in, I think it was chapter 4, right, where they're talking about that increase, and it was in that section. Was the section that you were talking about the one that says, in which we describe how the overall course of human history has meant that most people live their lives on an ever smaller scale as populations get larger?
Yes, and if you keep reading, they say, and this is where domination. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
making it black and white
Right.
because they're all over the place, in my opinion. That's where I agree with Justin. They go all over the map. What I'm trying to do is extract a coherent thread out of this book.
Mm-hmm.
Because as far as I can see, they don't do that. They claim they have a science of history, and they claim they have a social theory. So what they need to do is state clearly that theory and then show how the facts support that theory.
Well, I think that the thing that they talk about on that very next page on 123, they're talking about, people become different and they develop regional cuisines, right? Fish stew and porridge and, and this seems all very benign at this point, right? And very like, oh, cultural differences, we can celebrate those. We like going to places and, and seeing, different cuisines. But isn't that on the same spectrum as, the people in California and Oregon who, hate each other because they either keep slaves or they don't keep slaves? That's another similar thing, isn't it? Kevin, go ahead.
Thanks. I wasn't sure whether I needed to raise my hand in such a small number, but I thought it would be worth looking at, given what John's been saying, what Mike's been saying, that the idea of schismogenesis seems at odds with, as he says, the concept of self-determination, that kind of autonomy, and which seems to be part of the anarchist project of the authors to talk about human freedom and to avoid the kind of traps of developmentalism that see people inexorably caught up in a process beyond their control or whatever. But it seems to me schismogenesis isn't really explained within the terms of the book, because it does refer to a process that's beyond the individual. And I think it belongs to Geoffrey Bateson originally in his work, but it does, for me, conjure up the work of René Girard, the concept of memetic rivalry that's part of this, I think, very interesting school of genetic anthropology, which looks at the conflict between forces within a society as being the originary kind of condition of that society, and that culture emerges, particularly the sacred, as a means of transcending that particular kind of conflict. But it is very much this rivalry at the basis. And it feels like they're drawing from a theory of that kind of scale, which maybe posits certain factors beyond individual stratagems, but in order to but they're not really thinking about what are the theoretical structures you need to be able to include that, because I think it would undermine their approach.
Yeah, it might. In that part where they kind of wind up to saying the fourth possibility, right? Our societies, in effect, self-determining, building and reproducing themselves primarily with reference to each other. It doesn't seem like the second thing necessarily follows from the first, right? I think that might be one way in which societies would be self-determining, right? Building these mirror images and defining themselves by refusal, like Maus said, or about 6 pages earlier, they live by borrowing from one another, but they define themselves rather by the refusal of borrowing rather than by the acceptance. Go ahead, Mike.
You're on mute, Mike.
There we go. Thank you, Kevin. Okay. I mean, I am trying to use the principle of charity with this book, which means I find it really easy to rip them apart. And, I feel like they're just loving ripping everybody else apart. So the principle of charity tells me, let me impose the most generous way of understanding what they might be saying. And I don't think they make it clear.
Yeah.
So they talk about Christopher Bohm. I never heard of this guy before, but I went online and I just skimmed a couple of his journal articles because his book was like $40 or something. I wasn't going to buy that. But I like him. They were very, well, they were mixed. They liked some things about him and they criticized others. But what he does is he makes a very clear distinction between individual drives and collective decisions. So I would frame Graeber and Wenger differently. What I would say is there is an innate human drive in individuals to disobey. Now, just because it's innate does not mean we have to fall into any Rousseauian or Hobbesian fallacy. Because Christopher Bohm has shown, and I think very convincingly, and his work is based on evolutionary biologists. I know I use that terrible word, evolution, but that is the way life works. There was, a long time ago, there were just individual bacteria or archaea. And then somehow a bacterium joined together with an archaea. And instead of pursuing their individual interests, they each sacrificed a little bit of their individual interest and had this prokaryotic revolution. Big deal. So biology, and I would argue society too, always has multiple levels of analysis. So there's no problem saying we have an innate drive as individuals to disobey. Just like we can say we have an innate drive to dominate. But the fact is, as far as we know, we always existed in bands or some kind of group. So we can always, from our very beginning, I agree with them, we can always institute social structures that encourage or inhibit certain drives. So I would say that this drive to disobey is innate. This whole thing about schismogenesis, that doesn't seem fundamental to me. That's like saying we have an innate capacity to read. Well, yes, we can read, but that doesn't explain how it came about. It's like after we reached a certain level of development, we were able to use pre-existing capacities and we could read. So to me, schismogenesis is not really innate. It only becomes possible once the population grew large enough. And then all of a sudden, it turns out that whatever our innate properties were, it's like learning how to read. We all kind of wanted to differentiate ourselves. We wanted collectively to differentiate our groups from other groups. So schismogenesis is secondary. The drive to disobey is primary.
I don't see them as being exactly the same thing. It seems to me that schismogenesis is more the drive to differentiate. I don't know that that's necessarily the same as the drive to disobey. And it does seem like we do have an innate tendency to define ourselves in comparison with others. Go ahead, Justin.
Yeah, I had a kind of different interpretation on the schismogenesis, although that did strike me as like, I didn't feel like they really explained anything with that there. But so I kind of formulated my own theory of where it originates. And I'll run that by you guys and we'll just see what, whatever. But like, so you got these groups of people, like certainly people grouped at some point. We weren't all one single group at some point. We all were always scattered at some point, like maybe not to all the continents, but like we didn't all live in the same cave or whatever. So there was always some group that got separated, and maybe by quite a distance. And so it's kind of my own observation or intuition about this is like anytime you have separated groups, they're going to diverge in their behavior. Like just because they're all kind of randomly doing stuff, and this group decides they like to eat fish soup, and that group decides they really prefer prawns instead, you know, and that becomes a cultural trait of those two groups, and kind of like pulling things out of the air to just illustrate what I mean.
Yeah.
And then when they kind of come back together, like they notice like they have naturally othered, and so they'll say like those other people, they do some stuff I actually make me uncomfortable. And like you were saying, Dan, they like will tend to, I don't know, because of our psychology or the way that our brains are wired, will notice the pattern of the contrast and try to differentiate each other based on that. And that just like drives schismogenesis. That's what it does. Like anytime you get groups separated, they'll tend to do slightly different things. And then our own wanting to identify and feel comfortable with things we're familiar with will amplify the differences. So like that's it. That's all I thought about that, and I kind of moved on from there, and that's how you have all these different groups.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I mean it has resonance in, you know, in politics of the last 5 years or so, right? That the things that divide us may not really be that important, but they're the things that get focused on, right? And so the other thing I think, you know, and actually, Justin, I think this goes back, you know, maybe to, you know, to what both you and Mike were saying about the thing that gets me about all of these statements is they try to make, and all of these, I mean, I think sociology and anthropology are sort of defined by this desire to make absolute statements that apply to everybody, right? And so I really liked, I mean, that the statement that Mauss, that they quote from Mauss on 174, right, when they say societies live by borrowing from each other. I think I've already said it. You know, but they define themselves rather by the refusal of borrowing than by its acceptance. I thought, oh, that's an insight. I didn't take that as oh, that's the answer, which I think, I mean, my sense is that is kind of what, you know, maybe they want to do, but and I think that the reason why they're failing to do it is because you can't say, you know, this is one thing. It's like on 190, you know, on one, well, it's not 194. That's the other thing. It's on 184 when they talk about this fourth possibility. And I'm willing to accept, you know, the fourth possibility as a fourth possibility among the other three. And now we have more possibilities, you know, with which to understand in different circumstances what might be going into how societies are forming themselves, right? I didn't take that to be a suggestion that, you know, that this is a fourth option and we have to choose one of them that's going to be the right one. And I think that is a fault generally of, you know, of a lot of this kind of, well, a lot of anthropology for me, it seems like wants to do that. And so when I read this stuff, I tend to look at, you know, to look for things that I can say, oh, that's another possibility. And I am, you know, I was arguing for the, you know, for kind of the validity of the things they were citing. Where I sort of part ways with them is on, you know, whether or not you can generalize from the things that they're citing, right? You know, they talk about, you know, they moving on, right? They talk about, you know, Chattel-Hoyuk and, you know, and these people were, you know, were preserving. I really liked that idea. I mean, it was a beautiful image. Get down, buddy. That they were preserving, you know, they had preserved the skulls of aurochs. right? Rather than, when other people were already herding cattle and had been for 1,000 years, right? These people are still hunting the wild auroch because, for some reason that's cooler. And a world in which, those things, those are choices that you make is an interesting world, isn't it? That they've got this, they make this deliberate choice to hunt and eat this wild, dangerous ancestor of modern cattle instead of, having herds of cows that they have to take care of. There is a theory that, that the megafaunal extinctions, had something to do with prestige, if not trophy hunting.
I felt like
This
is not what I was going to chime in with, but go ahead, Kevin, actually.
I was just saying, just briefly, that their main target seems to be the idea of the agricultural revolution as being this overarching determinant in terms of human society. And even though schismogenesis has a similar kind of theoretical determinism attached to it, it at least offers a plurality of determinisms, which may be useful for them in this case. Sorry, Justin.
No, it's all good. You said something far more intelligent than what I'm about to say, which is I had the risk, I latched onto one of their sub phrases at some point where they're talking about the extinction of the megafauna, and they say something along the lines of the megafauna were ill suited for the post ice age environment, and so that was something else that contributed to their extinction. And I don't know whether it was that they were maladapted to the new post glaciated environment, or they were hunted into extinction. I tend to think it was humans' fault, but it felt like they were just kind of excusing that that component.
There's a lot of controversy about that still, and I think it varies from place to place, and the timing of it varies from place to place. Right, in Australia, I think there's I haven't read about Australia for the last 10 years or so, but it seemed to me for a while there that it was much earlier in things that I had read. Do you mind if I jump in before? Go ahead, Mike.
Go again.
Yep, go ahead.
So I wanted to say, I had another response to this absolutism of the statements of anthropologists and sociologists and things like that, and I just find I'm just having an allergic reaction to that. The arrogance and hubris of each generation of people thinking they've got the right answer and they've got the final story that actually explains things just seems like, can we not learn and stop doing that? It's a theory, it's a guess. You're doing it with in the case of Chattahoyuk is how Dan was pronouncing it, 5%, you examine 5% of the site and you're drawing conclusions. It's just blowing my mind that these people say it with such conviction. So which kind of goes back to my previous criticism is maybe we should look at those individuals that are making those claims and why, where they are in their career, what their environment is before we assess the value of the thing they're writing. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, good. Wait a minute. Yeah, good. I'm talking. Well, now let me lower my hand. Sorry for this incompetence. Okay. So, schismogenesis. Separate locations, having groups of human beings in separate locations is, according to Graeber and Wenger, not sufficient for there to be schismogenesis. Because that's the whole point of chapter 4. In the Upper Paleolithic, we had cosmopolitan societies that lacked schismogenesis. And then with the retreat of the glaciers, we move to what they say, the anthropologists, I don't know any of this stuff, called the Mesolithic. There was an increase in population, and that was the explanation. Now, I could be reading too much into them, and I certainly agree that single causes to explain all of history are pretty impoverished. But I would still ask, is schismogenesis one of their primitives? Are they saying, look, we just have schismogenesis. That's what it is to be human. Well, then I would ask, okay, why didn't we have schismogenesis in the upper Pleistocene during the, what do you call it? The Ice Age. So the only way, and I see it in that from page 121 forward, that's where they say population increase. So I don't think I'm reading too much. Now, the point is, you can find 50 other things elsewhere in the book that say other stuff, because I agree with Justin. They contradict themselves right and left. That's why what I'm trying to do is come up with some kind of explanatory framework. Now, it might be that it's just a futile project.
I mean, I kind of de-weight that like upper Pleistocene era of sort of universal cultures that span entire continents, and just my skepticism about that is due to the lack of evidence of all the details of that society. So like arrowheads, yeah, okay, arrowheads is a technology that can have a very useful style that like could go and span across all kinds of different local cultures that have schismogenesis that we just don't have any evidence of, because they did all their stuff in wood and animal hides that are completely gone because that was 15,000 years ago. So I'm not a buyer of the claim that there wasn't schismogenesis in that era, just because there's only one type of arrowhead or whatever, pottery shard or whatever the evidence is. I'm also not educated on it, and I'm willing to wear my naivety in this area. So if somebody comes with evidence that like tells me I'm wrong, cool, sounds good, I'll update. But anyway, that's kind of where I was at with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does seem to have something to do with, and it doesn't, I agree, it's not well described or defined, but it does seem to have something to do with population density, right? Where you actually have different groups of people that are rubbing up against each other, and there's something at stake, right? So maybe it's a question of stakes as well. They do the other period that they talk about in the Gardens of Adonis in chapter 6, when they're talking about the upland and lowland regions of Mesopotamia, and this, and then they're talking about this cultural opposition or schismogenesis between 10,000 and 8,000 BCE, and that seemed kind of interesting. It did seem kind of, I mean, it was unexpected for me that the lowland cultures were going to be the ones that they described as, agricultural and with feminine values and or gendered differently, so that women had some influence and had some power because they were the people who did a lot of the plant domestication. I really liked their description of domestication from the point of view of the plant, where a plant is domesticated when it can no longer reproduce naturally and it requires human intervention. And I think that they describe that as happening, with wheat-like grasses in Mesopotamia from 20 to 200 years. Lots of other slower transitions, though, right?
I actually have to 20 to 200 years was the modern experiment done in the 80s to demonstrate it could be done that quickly, but right. It took 3,000 years in natural history to occur.
Well, they compare. They say that it took 3,000 years for there to be evidence that these cultures changed to settled farming, right? And so, mm-hmm. so what I drew from that was the implication that they were choosing to play for that period rather than to get serious and settle down to being farming people. I think there are other.
I kind of read it like. I thought I had my interpretation of that several long passages was like they didn't fully establish the concept of farming. Like, yeah, there was the play thing was going on, but like the process of domesticating various plants took a long time to accomplish. Whether it was because they weren't serious about it, or they just didn't bother to invest the energy into the process because there was perfectly good forage to go after instead, or because they hadn't yet invented the concept of science, and so like figuring out that you could domesticate a plant was like that it was a possibility to go for, so I don't know. It seemed like it was the intent was it took much longer than that shortest possible time, which was 20 to 200 years.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Justin. I think you have to know that there's an endpoint that you're going for, because what I was going to compare it to was the transition from Teosinte to Maize in Mexico, right? Which probably took a lot longer because it's a much longer,
the distance between the domesticated plant and the native grass
and the native grass. Yeah,
how did you even do that?
Right. Well, and the thing is that there is. That not only it probably took much longer, but each step along the way, there would have been useful outputs, right? So in this incremental, the incremental change and the incremental improvement would have been valuable without, the idea that, it's not good enough because it's not, what we now think of as, hybrid corn on the cob. So yeah, I think that's they're in danger, I think, in a lot of these cases of kind of if they were historians, we'd call it teleology or something like that, right? So Kevin, interesting to compare well, yeah, and it's interesting, the moiety systems and this idea of culture areas and clan, the idea that there are these clans that that Native Americans belong to that are possibly continental in scope, and that you do have a kind of a claim on some people far away if you do exercise that first right to leave.
I guess I haven't bothered to investigate the word moiety enough. Maybe help. I don't know what you guys are talking about with that there.
Moiety is very big in many Aboriginal cultures in Australia, and it's often about the relationship between wet and dry. So it's a way of dividing up the world, similar to, say, in language like French, which divides it up between masculine and feminine, that the whole world is divided up and individuals locate themselves on one side, which determines who it is that they can speak to, who they can marry, certainly. A whole range of activities are governed by that. I think it's more tightly connected in terms of those two halves, that binary, than you'd find in schismogenesis. Like, you'd hardly say the conflict between the USA and China, which might be a kind of schismogenesis at a global scale, is not really about a moiety, even though there might be prohibitions about what can and cannot be done. But it seems if you're reaching that kind of level of explanation, then it's good to start thinking about what's at play with the way this bifurcation occurs. For Levi-Strauss, it's something about the mind, and it's a kind of a structuralism which is to do with kind of binary system that we have. Whereas with schismogenesis, I think it turns out to be something more like systems theory. It's just how it is that large communities can grow and what happens when they start to develop.
That's super helpful, because I was not picking that up at all, even though I'm kind of familiar with those different ways to divide the world and group. Could it also be like a way of I think this is one of the arguments of how we formed larger groups. If you have a common religion, you can easily identify people you don't know personally as, safe to do business with or whatever. And so this is another part in that system, I guess. I'm a member of the Eagle clan, so wherever I find other Eagle clan members is cool. Like it's a good place to be.
Right. Well, that perhaps is more like the totemic system that Emil Durkheim developed in his sociology, where there would be that kind of division, which isn't a binary one because it's not exclusive, but it offers us as kind of a common language of belief, of cosmology that people can connect with.
Yeah. John, Ricardo, do you want to throw anything in here as we're moving through this?
We haven't got to chapter 6 yet, have we?
No, I kind of agree, especially with Justin. I think they needed a better editor. It's like they throw so much in there, and I accept Kevin's point that or was it Mike, that they contradict themselves. Well, it's hard to make those traces for me, so it's kind of a slog, but I find the discussion very interesting.
Okay, and you got to go.
Yeah, I got to go. Thanks
right.
a lot. I'll see you next week. I assume it's going to be Friday next week.
Yeah, we'll move back to Fridays. Yep.
Super. All right.
Okay.
Good night, everyone.
Happy New Year. Okay, Ricardo, you're good to be lurking. All right, that's fine. No pressure. So then they go. I think they were in need of an editor, but I sometimes I just think they're having fun too, and I think they're having fun when they say on 236 when they say Genesis is also one of history's most enduring charters for the hatred of women, which made me laugh. I think it also applies to hatred of farmers as well. Right, Cain is the bad guy; he's the farmer, and then later in Exodus, even the Egyptians are the bad guys. The semi-nomadic shepherds are the heroes of all the stories, all the way down to the New Testament and the shepherd of men. So, it does seem to me that that domesticating plants and what they call Neolithic ecology, and probably, I would agree, more sloppily than a good editor would have, forced them to define some of their terms. But it does seem to me that the status of women, all of these ideas kind of go together.
This has particular purchase in Australia because somebody's put up in the vault the book by Bruce Pascoe, Dark Emu, which was intended to address what was seen as terra nullius, the concept that no people occupied Australia before the British came because they were nomads, and that wasn't a form of occupation. To occupy, you had to plant and to tend the land. And so his book argues that, look, if you look carefully enough, you'll find what we see as agriculture. They weren't primitive, they were developed. And this provided a kind of a narrative. But more recently, writers have said, whoa, just because they developed, agriculture shouldn't be the criterion by which you study development.
This is what I was arguing last week.
Flocks and planted cereals and so on. It doesn't mean that their society wasn't sophisticated in many other ways. And so we're undergoing a similar kind of debate here, and it turns out that some justify Bruce Pascoe, Dark Emu, to say that strategically, at least it's dealing with the first kind of colonial prejudice about Aboriginal Australians, that they were primitive, even though it's within the terms of the colonists. So it's a kind of progressive deconstruction of that. That's been the way in which there's been some alignment between the two positions.
I think it's going to be difficult to make real substantial progress in that area because, like, the land was taken by force, and when you start to make these logical arguments that I think are totally valid, like the native people who lived in the land before, they were the stewards, owners, caretakers, whatever you want to call it. Like, it was their land, and the colonists came and took it. And once you start to say things like like, they were actually doing silviculture, or, in the Northeast of America. I'm not sure what the term is for the Australian agriculture. But like, that just gives credibility to the original owners of the land. And like, that's not going to be allowed in our current political environment, which maybe is where Graeber and Wendell are going ultimately. But yeah, like, I think this is the point in the conversation last week where I said this is where I start to sound like the anarchist, but
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think it's we did talk about this a little bit last week. It is, I think, I mean, William Cronin and others have said that about the things that people were doing in the Northeast of America. I think there's it's interesting. I haven't really studied exactly where that comes from in sort of British culture. I mean, there is this kind of very, there's probably a history there that goes from, enclosure to, and all of that in English history, to this idea that, that the land is very valuable and it needs to be, and to give them a little bit of credit, right? That we're afraid of scarcity, we're afraid of famine. The land needs to be worked, it needs to be improved. You're irresponsible if you're not doing it the way we understand it. And then just the failure to see that, people who don't have draft animals are not going to plow fields and things like that. Go ahead, Mike. You're still muted. Yep, there you go.
I think we read something about that, Dan, in an earlier chapter where they talked about Locke.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Locke had this idea, which they talk about when you mix your labor with the land.
Right.
And the justification. Well, first, I just want to point out, well, you don't have to accept my argument, but, what they say is when I mix some of what is me, namely my labor, with something that is other than me, namely the land, that which is other becomes part of me. The structure of that argument is not very strong. And I forget who made this originally. It might have been that right-winger anarchy-state utopia, Nozick. But anyway, somebody, I think it was Nozick, said, look, if I take the Staten Island ferry from Manhattan to Staten Island and I prick my finger and a few drops of blood fall in whatever that body of water is over there, I've lost some blood. I didn't take possession of the entire whatever that is, that body of water. So anyway, but you were asking what is the history of that? That's where Wenger and Graeber really, they try to show how do you justify colonialism. And what Locke said was that there's a proviso. You can enclose the land with the proviso that there must be as much and as good left over. So that was the justification for privatizing the United States, as much and as good. In other words, I'm not hurting you, Dan, if I enclose land when there's just as fertile and valuable land all over the place, like America had. So then the question becomes, all right, but what do you do with population growth? The precise question that Wenger and Graeber pose in the transition, which is key, from the Upper Paleolithic to the Mesolithic. And Locke's answer is a little fuzzy, but what he seems to be saying is, well, if you work the land assiduously, you actually haven't taken anything out of what is common. Oh, by the way, they start with Genesis. God gave the earth to human beings collectively, in common. So his problem is, how do we justify God's will from our violation of it? So what he seems to be saying is, what happens when we privatize land? Well, the output of the land, and this is what chapter 1 and 2 was about, the output of the land increases so that we actually have as much and as good left over because collectively we're producing more. Obviously, it's a bad argument.
Yeah. I think it's, I mean, that God gave the land to humans is one interpretation, right? They're so, oh, you going, Kevin? Okay, see ya. Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there are a bunch of yeah, I don't know. There are a bunch of just kind of vague images that float around. I think they do, Grave and Wengrow do a good job of kind of bringing these issues up. They don't necessarily do as well, kind of closing. They're not closers. They
I think they do. Yeah, they're bringing up a diversity of things, and they are like provoking questions. Like in chapter 6, when they talk about the upper and lower Fertile Crescent groups, like my immediate question is like, well, what else was going on on the planet? And they do kindly have a map showing a bunch of different areas that were important for agriculture, and some ones that I wasn't aware of, which is awesome. So lots of other places to go and look, which I think was kind of your hope with the Obsidian Vault, but unfortunately I'm probably not going to be doing any of that research in that vault or anytime this month. But over the years I can look for other books that kind of speak to those other areas, because they do bring up a lot of other things that they don't resolve or close, but do point out in a way that I have kind of come to accept is legitimate, is that, like, there are other ways of doing this. There were many other cultures that occurred throughout history where they did things in a way that was different than ours, and was stable. Like Çatalhöyük was, I mean, there's not much other interpretation than it was a stable society for 1,000 years. Rebuilding houses in the same location 18 times on the same spot. Like, that's like, there's not much room for me to wiggle and ask for, was this a society in transition? Like, what was going on here in that kind of situation? So that's some stuff that we really got to examine and think about from a new perspective, not just saying, well, they were hunter-gatherers, like they weren't really serious about farming, so we don't need to take them serious either. Like, this is the thing that I find most useful about this book, actually, and kind of accepting that they're not going to close their arguments, but they are going to bring up points. And maybe that's frustrating to you, Mike. So let's hear what you have to say.
I'm just curious what other people think with what I believe to be their main ideas, namely that we once were free, using their definition of freedom, not Rousseau's. And, that is to say, it's not based on equality, it's based on something else. We once were free, now we are not free. And we believe that relations of hierarchy and domination are unchangeable, immutable.
Mm-hmm. I think that is one of the things that fascinates me about it. The other thing, though, is sort of these continual kind of inversions, right? Because they talked about Göbekli Tepe before, right, as this place where where maybe there was something different going on, right? And now they talk at the end of chapter 6, they talk about it again, but it's a male dominated upland society that's focused on hunting and violence, including possibly human sacrifice. They've got, decapitated heads laying around or on, hanging from their, from their walls or on, on stakes, and so that once again, I mean, for me, that was another one of those moments when I was thinking, well, what's going on with this general, the generalization? What do we generalize from this? Is this local schismogenesis? Because they do say, the more that the uplanders came to organize their artistic and ceremonial lives around this theme of predatory male violence, the more the lowlanders tended to organize theirs around female knowledge and symbolism. That would be one place where I would say, okay, show me some more receipts. But even
it a bit.
Yeah, even if they, even if I accept that, and they have evidence to back that up, is this generalizable? Is this relevant beyond this observation of this particular, conflict, which I imagine there probably is conflict, because that's probably, for me, that's probably what does drive some of this schismogenesis, right? But then what about, other people have described, sort of administrative centers and, and hierarchical communities in these lowlands, in these farming areas. This is where, the temple stores the grain, and they protect it against the raiders coming down from the hills and all of this, in other descriptions, like James Scott's, in all of the work he did in Southeast Asia. So, so the anarchists are in the hills in that case, and the structured societies are in the valleys. And so who are we rooting for here? And how, and does this generalize at all? And how does it map to this gender distinction that they're trying to make here? So yeah, I'm not. And then of course, the final thing is, if all of this original farming is, sort of feminine and egalitarian, then what went wrong down in the valley?
So from to kind of go back to both, my response to both you, Dan, and to Mike, is the theory I'm synthesizing out of what I've read so far. I've read up to the end of chapter 7 and no further, so I don't know where we're going per se with this book. But my extraction from all this evidence they're presenting us is that human society is going to try lots of different things. We're going to try to accumulate some technologies as we go, and it's true, as the population increases, the sort of fracturing or differentiating schismogenesis of groups will increase, or it won't, with the advent of telecommunication. So it kind of homogenizes a lot of things. But up to that point, you just keep trying all the different random things that people come up with and like over the generations, and that's how it works. And so the conclusion then is, no, we're not stuck in the hierarchical system that we currently live in today. We just have a very short lifespan and experience of it, and we don't know what we will consider inevitable 1,000 years from now, for what their society is going to be like. So it's kind of a hopeful book in that sense, in that you don't need to feel stuck. This is just the way it's going to be forever. We're going to be in this battle with some other group, like the Pax Americana versus the Chinese boogeyman. It's not going to last that way forever. That's my current take.
Okay, Mike.
Yeah, Justin, that's exactly the question Dan just asked. Is this generalizable? That is to say, before we got stuck, we had a certain looseness, fluidity, and flexibility to our social structure. And then all hitherto existing social theorists have said we have lost it. So the question that Dan's posing and Justin is posing is, are those properties of human beings that were specific to those historical epochs, or can it be generalizable? And we're just in a short, I don't know, Dan, what is it, 8,000 year side? I'm not a historian, so don't quote me on the numbers, but we're in the middle of an 8,000 year detour.
Yeah, and to what extent does the, do hierarchies go with, particular styles of production, right? And do they necessarily, right? And do we have to have the level of hierarchy that we have for the world that we're living in now, or has it, is it just a holdover from a previous thing? I think that, it's kind of weird because I don't know if the cycle, Mike, is 8,000 years or if it's 500 though, because in
something shorter.
Yeah, the only reason that I'm coming up with 500 is because that's the cycle length that Graeber's talking about in Debt. The first 5,000 years is a kind of an oscillation between
my statistical experience on both of those, any of those numbers, is we have no idea what we're talking about. We don't have the evidence to make those kind of claims. Like those numbers that now we're getting into math, an area I'm comfortable with, and those are not numbers that I feel anybody should feel any confidence in whatsoever. You can put a number up, you can draw a line on the dots you currently have, but so many dots are missing from our historical record that I don't feel like you can. Well, you won't convince me. That's all. That's what I'll say.
No, I would agree with that. I think that there is, in general, I am very suspicious of generalizing, and that's my objection to anthropology.
Well, the generalization I was making, Mike, was that there's a lot of randomness in the system, and we're still walking through that randomness, and we will continue to do so. So, that I felt like was a conclusion, but it seemed like you didn't think I was making a statement and was still asking a question. So, I felt like I was making a statement and answering a question.
Okay, but I'll put this question out there. We cannot, like the devil can quote scripture. We can find anything in this book to attribute any position to them, including that you can't make generalizations. That was the whole matter of taste quote. Yeah. But anyway, my view of this is this book is first and foremost a takedown of the big icons in social science. And what is their methodological process? They take generalizations and then they provide counterexamples.
Right, exactly.
That is what this book is.
Yeah.
Now, Justin keeps saying, well, and I agree. I personally think humans probably made the woolly mammoth extinct. But to me, that's like not my primary concern with this book. My primary concern with this book is, how do they explain society, and what are the social political implications for us today? Because I believe that is why they wrote this book. It is a manifesto.
Yeah, I think we will probably begin to see that a little bit more clearly next week, because I think we're moving on to cities.
Yeah. Cities is Cities of Imagination or something is the title of the next chapter. Yeah.
But as I recall from the first time I read through it, it's a little bit muddy as well. So maybe we won't get there. But
I think if I step back a bit from the particular arguments, I think they're Graeber and Wengrow are taking this moment when we have more opportunity for non-conservative established theories, and like trying to peel back some of that stuff that was written in the 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s, 30s, 20s, that was like the very established, like, you know, Rousseauian or Lockean or whatever argument, and say, look, it's much more complicated than that. Like, I think that's going to be the main, which, you know, anybody who thinks about it for like half a second, it's obvious it's much more complicated than that. But like, to do it in a book that's aimed essentially at a public audience is the thing that they're doing today.
Yeah.
Which,
Do you think
you know,
that
I'm glad they wrote
project
it.
is possible? That is to say, can we use archaeological, not do they do it well? You know, that's a whole other question. But is it possible to have archaeological evidence to justify claims that human beings have a primordial drive to resist domination, that once population increases, human beings will necessarily, he uses this word, he says population growth is a necessary condition for cultural differentiation. And he says when there is cultural porosity, when that necessary condition was absent, there wasn't domination. So, you know, do we think that's possible? I mean, to me, that seems plausible, but I have no technical knowledge about any of this.
That seems really difficult.
It seems difficult to say that in the same way that what they're doing is that they're providing, you know, counter evidence to break the master narrative of prehistory, right?
Yeah.
You know, I think it would be difficult for them to replace it with a new master narrative that says, you know, in all cases, you know, people were free, right? And they were only playing when they did hierarchy. Well, you know, when does play, you know, give way to seriousness, right?
Yeah, I'm pretty dubious that they weren't people that were dominant over other people, you know, 20,000 years ago, 80,000 years ago. I don't know. I know I have a limited experience with human nature, but I feel like people that would do that existed back then too. If we're going to argue that they were as smart and as sophisticated as we are today, just lacking technology and, you know, whatever, you know, broad definition of technology, then they did that too.
Yeah. Plessy.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes left, so I'm sort of, without asking, taking permission to take this discussion in another direction. Remember what we were saying in the previous session, Dan, about the mnemonic structures, and not much was said about written language. Since the mnemonic structures were more used in the Paleolithic and Mesolithic age, I mean, did the fact that writing came into existence later on sort of contribute to the static structure of societies and the things that we lost because it was aided by the fact of writing? It's just something I throw into the air. I don't know anything about it.
I definitely feel like that's a contributor, because it does stabilize knowledge and information, and so you have things that people can point to and use against other people and say, like, look, it was like this in the past. Whereas before, when the sum total of knowledge had to be held in some small group of people's minds, and they had to tell the story of it to the next generation in order to keep it. Like I would like to make the claim more strongly than like, yeah, it's obvious, but like that's how it feels to me.
What is it? I just got this book and I haven't read it yet. This Lynn Kelly book, the knowledge and power in in prehistoric societies. It seems to be the academic book, probably her dissertation book, that then turned into more accessible kind of popular titles. The thing that I worry that I wonder about, though, Plessy, is doesn't the fact that you're building something massive and monumental as a society suggest that the knowledge, if it does have a mnemonic characteristic, that knowledge is even more solid and unchangeable and and immutable, right? Where once people can write, then anybody with a stylus and a sheet of papyrus or a clay tablet can write things down. I mean, it seems to me that writing, that you were characterizing writing as the thing that sort of that creates this power relationship that takes knowledge away from everybody. But it seemed, I mean, I would imagine it the opposite, as being something that makes it more accessible.
It depends on the distribution of literacy, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So like if only special people are allowed to read and write things, then that concentrates the power. And that was only broken in the last 100 years or something.
Well, everything's relative, right? Temple scribes maybe in doing writing on cuneiform tablets in Babylon, but even that, if you move from, if you go from one set of people that that kind of set the, I mean, if these, I mean, and again, I haven't read the book yet, but if a lot of this cultural knowledge is perpetuated in this way with these epics and and oral traditions and mnemonics, I'm not sure that necessarily means that it's more democratic, because of a handful of scribes might be might be more than the one person who gets to decide where the standing stones are or whatever in at Stonehenge, and then of course it seems to me that every increase in communication technology has widened the scope of participation. So I would be suspicious of the first one going in the opposite direction. But
I'll just throw in one glib comment. That's, if there's one thing I know they're against more than anything, it's technological determinism. So writing is a technology.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I think we all need to go. So thanks, everybody. We will take this up. We didn't really do chapter 7. Are you guys okay with us doing 7 and 8 next week?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask in the previous session. Nobody said anything much, except I think Justin said a bit because he read chapter 7.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's fine. I can. We can do 7 and 8 next week. That'd be great.
Okay, cool. Well, then that's what I will, I'll plan, and I'll make something, I'll make a little announcement. I think I already asked a question about that in the community thing, but yeah, that'll be the plan then. And we'll do it on a Friday.
Sounds good.
All right.
Thank you all for the great conversation. It's very interesting today.
Thank you. It was fun. And Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Happy New Year.
Bye-bye.